Why does the world celebrate Versailles in France, the Forbidden City in China, and even ancient Mayan pyramids? But hardly anyone talks about the royal palaces of Benin. These weren't just mud huts lost in the jungle. They were once described as a city built with such skill and beauty that even Europe could not match it. Yet today, barely a trace of them remains. Why? Because they were deliberately burned, looted, and erased from history. And the shocking truth is that many of their treasures are still locked away in museums thousands of miles from Africa. This is the untold story of the hidden palaces of Benin, a story that shatters stereotypes of Africa as primitive and forgotten. These palaces were centers of power, dazzling courts filled with bronze masterpieces, ivory carvings, sprawling courtyards, and walls so long they rivaled the Great Wall of China. But what happened to them? Why does the world know so little about one of Africa's most advanced kingdoms? And how is the fight to reclaim their legacy still going on today? The problem is simple but painful. History has been written by those who destroyed Benin's greatness. When the British invaded in 1897, they didn't just conquer a kingdom. They torched its palaces, slaughtered its defenders, and looted thousands of artworks. These artifacts, known today as the Benin bronzes, became trophies in European museums. Meanwhile, the memory of the palaces themselves faded into silence. But here's the challenge. How do we bring these hidden palaces back into the world's imagination? How do we uncover the truth about what they looked like, how they functioned, and what they meant to the people of Benin? And more importantly, how do we confront the uncomfortable fact that much of this history sits in glass cases in London, Berlin, and New York instead of where it belongs, in Benin City itself? This is where our journey begins. To understand the hidden palaces of Benin, we need to travel back in time. Back before colonialism, before the British invasion, before the burning. Back to the 11th century, when a small kingdom in what is now southern Nigeria began to rise and to build. To understand the hidden palaces of Benin, you first need to understand the kingdom itself. Long before European ships ever touched the West African coast, the land that would one day become Benin City was alive with bustling communities, fertile farmlands, and a people with an incredible gift for organizing society. Around the 11th century, the Edo people began to consolidate power in the region. At first, leadership came from village chiefs known as the Ogisos, meaning rulers of the sky. They laid the foundations of governance, but eventually the system became unstable. It was in this political vacuum that the Oba dynasty was born, the line of kings that would define Benin for centuries to come. The story goes that a young prince named Oranmiyan from the Yoruba kingdom of Ife was invited to bring order to the Edo lands. Though his stay was brief, he fathered a son, Iweka I, who became the first true Oba of Benin. From this point on, the Oba became not just a king, but a semi-divine figure, someone believed to hold sacred power, the bridge between the earthly and the spiritual. And at the very heart of this new system of rule was a palace. Not just a residence, but a sacred center of authority. For the Edo people, the Oba's palace wasn't just where the king lived. It was the nerve center of the kingdom. Decisions that affected the lives of tens of thousands were made there. Laws were proclaimed. Ceremonies honoring ancestors and gods took place. Foreign emissaries were received in its courtyards. The earliest palaces were simple at first, built largely from mud, wood, and thatch. But as the kingdom grew, so did the palaces. By the 15th century, Benin had entered its golden age, and the royal palace transformed into a sprawling complex that left foreign visitors stunned. The materials may surprise you. Unlike European castles of stone, Benin's palaces were built primarily of earth. But this wasn't crude or fragile. The Edo had mastered techniques of using packed clay and laterite soil to create walls that were thick, durable, and surprisingly cool in the sweltering heat. These walls were then decorated with carved wooden pillars, elaborate courtyards, and roofed halls that gave the entire complex a sense of majesty. One Portuguese visitor in the 16th century wrote that the city's palaces and houses were as large as those in Lisbon, noting their straight roads, massive walls, and the orderly layout of the city. To him, this wasn't the Africa he expected. It was a place of sophistication and design. But the palaces weren't just impressive structures in isolation. They were part of something even bigger, the legendary Benin walls. Imagine this, an interconnected system of earthworks stretching for nearly 16,000 kilometers. That's longer than the Great Wall of China. Built over centuries, these moats and walls encircled the city and its surrounding villages, offering defense but also symbolizing the power and control of the Oba. And at the very center of this massive system, the royal palace. As centuries passed, Benin's palaces didn't just reflect the kingdom's power, they fueled it. Benin controlled trade routes that connected the interior of Africa to the coast. Ivory, pepper, and palm oil flowed out. Cloth, beads, and later European goods flowed in. The Oba's palace became the hub for managing this wealth. Tribute poured in from surrounding chiefs, merchants came to bargain, and artisans produced the spectacular bronzes and ivories that we now know as the Benin bronzes. Every plaque, every sculpture, was designed not only as art, but as a record of the Oba's power and the grandeur of the palace itself. The palace wasn't just political and economic, it was spiritual. The Edo people believed that the Oba was the link between their ancestors and the gods. Rituals performed in the palace were thought to keep the kingdom safe, the harvest plentiful, and the people prosperous. The courtyards echoed with drumming and chanting during festivals like the Igwe festival, where the Oba's spiritual energy was renewed. Processions of warriors, chiefs, and dancers turned the palace into a living stage. Every wall and courtyard a backdrop to the drama of royal power. By the time Europeans began arriving in larger numbers in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were astonished. Portuguese, Dutch, and later English traders wrote descriptions of Benin City that almost sounded unbelievable. Wide streets, thousands of houses neatly arranged, and at its center, a palace unlike anything they had expected to find in Africa. One Dutch traveler, Olfert Dapper in 1668, wrote that the palace has as many courts as there are days in the year. While that was probably an exaggeration, it shows the impression the palace left on outsiders, something vast, ordered, and powerful. And yet, despite all this grandeur, these palaces were never meant to last forever. Built from earth, wood, and clay, they needed constant rebuilding. Each Oba added new halls, new courtyards, new decorations, expanding the palace like a living organism. The palace wasn't a static monument like Versailles. It was a breathing symbol of continuity, where tradition met constant renewal. Step inside the Palace of Benin, and you'd immediately know you were in the presence of power. The palace wasn't one single building. It was a sprawling complex made up of multiple courtyards, halls, shrines, and passageways. Each space had its own role, and each was designed to reflect the authority of the Oba. At the center of it all was the Oba's private quarters. This was the heart of the palace, where he lived, where he held private meetings, and where only the most trusted people could enter. Surrounding this were the public courtyards, where chiefs and emissaries gathered to discuss matters of state. These courtyards could be massive, with high clay walls and open roofs that let in sunlight while keeping the interiors cool. Inside, the floors were often polished smooth with red earth, sometimes decorated with inlaid designs. Wooden beams supported the thatched or later tiled roofs, and carved posts showed images of warriors, animals, and ancestors. The smell of burning wood, food, and incense would fill the air, mixing with the rhythm of drums and the calls of palace guards. The palace wasn't just home to the Oba. It was essentially a city within a city. Hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of people lived and worked within its walls. The royal family lived in different sections of the palace. The Queen Mother, known as the Ioba, had her own palace complex, often just as large and ornate as the king's. Uer the Great, one of the most powerful Obas in the 15th century, is remembered for formalizing many of these palace traditions, including building dedicated areas for different wives and officials. Servants and workers filled the courtyards. Cooks prepared meals in large clay ovens while messengers ran errands across the city. Craftsmen worked tirelessly in palace workshops, bronze casters, ivory carvers, and woodworkers who created the legendary art of Benin. Warriors guarded the gates, dressed in red uniforms with leopard skin accents, carrying spears and later firearms as trade with Europeans grew. The palace was buzzing with activity, a constant movement of people, animals, sounds, and ceremonies. The Oba's palace was more than a political space. It was the spiritual center of the kingdom. Every year, the palace hosted festivals that tied the living to the ancestors and the gods. The most important was the Ig festival. During this celebration, rituals were performed to renew the Oba's spiritual energy, believed to be the source of the kingdom's well-being. Inside the palace, sacred shrines were decorated with offerings, kola nuts, palm wine, and animal sacrifices. The air filled with drumming, chanting, and dancing as priests and chiefs honored both the ancestors and the Oba himself. There were also rituals tied to war. Before any major campaign, the Oba would consult oracles within the palace, offer sacrifices, and perform ceremonies at the shrines. Victories were celebrated in the palace too, often with the commissioning of bronze plaques or ivory carvings that recorded the triumph. What really set the palaces of Benin apart was their architecture. The Edo people used local materials, red earth, wood, and raffia palm, but transformed them into monumental works of design. Walls and courtyards. The palace walls weren't just functional, they were symbolic. Tall, thick, and decorated with reliefs, they were meant to separate the sacred space of the Oba from the ordinary world outside. Halls. Some halls were vast, capable of hosting hundreds of people at once. Wooden pillars carved with spiraling designs or animal motifs supported the roofs. In some descriptions, visitors said the roofs were covered with brass tiles that shone in the sun. Shrines. Throughout the palace, shrines dedicated to ancestors and gods stood in courtyards. Each shrine was a place of sacrifice and memory, decorated with bronze heads, ivory tusks, and sacred objects. A European visitor in the 17th century described the palace as being filled with long, broad streets with houses on each side, as straight as any in Holland. For a European expecting to find only huts, this was shocking. Perhaps the most famous legacy of Benin's palaces is its artwork. The palace wasn't just decorated with beauty, it was literally lined with history. The most iconic works are the Benin bronzes, thousands of plaques and sculptures made using the lost wax casting technique. These plaques were nailed to the wooden pillars of the palace, each one depicting moments of history. Obas in royal regalia, warriors in formation, traders bringing tribute, even encounters with Europeans. They turned the palace into a visual textbook of Benin's history. Alongside the bronzes were ivory carvings. Ivory tusks were carved with intricate designs showing gods, animals, and historical scenes. These tusks often stood atop bronze heads on palace altars, symbolizing the Oba's connection to the divine. Wood carvings, terracotta sculptures, and ceremonial masks added even more layers of symbolism. Every piece had a purpose, whether to glorify the Oba, honor ancestors, or mark important events. Walking through the palace must have felt like stepping into a living museum. Everywhere you turned, there were objects telling a story. The walls weren't bare. They were alive with images of past kings and heroes. The courtyards weren't empty. They were filled with shrines, statues, and artworks that linked the present Obado centuries of tradition. And unlike in Europe, where art was often hidden away in private collections, Benin's palace art was public, sacred, and political all at once. It reminded everyone, chiefs, visitors, and ordinary citizens, that the Oba's power was eternal. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Palace of Benin wasn't just a royal residence. It was the center of the kingdom's identity. Foreign visitors marveled at its scale. Artisans created masterpieces within its walls. Priests conducted rituals that tied the kingdom to the gods, and warriors stood ready to defend it. For the Edo people, the palace wasn't just a building, it was a sacred symbol of their civilization. Losing it would mean losing a part of their soul. And tragically, that's exactly what was about to happen. By the 15th century, ships from Portugal had reached the West African coast. What they found in Benin shocked them. They expected primitive villages, but instead they saw wide streets, tall walls, and a palace at the heart of a thriving kingdom. The Portuguese struck up trade. At first it was goods like pepper, cloth, ivory, and coral beads. But over time, the trade became darker. Guns, gunpowder, and even slaves became part of the exchanges. Still, the Obas of Benin remained firmly in control. Foreign traders had to respect palace rules and operate under the Oba's authority. For the Oba, trade wasn't just about wealth. It was about power. The new firearms strengthened Benin's armies, while luxury goods like coral beads and brass rods became symbols of status inside the palace. The influx of copper and brass also allowed artisans to produce more of the spectacular bronzes that lined the palace walls. As the centuries passed, more Europeans came. Dutch, English, and French traders all wrote detailed accounts of what they saw. In 1602, the Dutch traveler Alfred Dapper described Benin City as having long straight streets and palaces with as many courts as there are days in the year. Though exaggerated, his words reflect the awe these visitors felt. The palace impressed not only with its scale but also with its discipline. Europeans marveled at the order of the court, the rituals, and the strict laws. Unlike some European monarchs who were far removed from their people, the Oba held court openly in vast courtyards where chiefs, soldiers, and even foreign envoys could witness his power. But as time went on, the relationship between Benin and Europe grew strained. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain had become the dominant power on the West African coast. They were no longer satisfied with trading under the Oba's terms. They wanted control of trade routes, of resources, and of political influence. The palace stood in the way. The Oba wasn't just a ruler, he was a symbol of independence. So long as his palace remained the center of authority, the British couldn't bend Benin to their will. Tensions rose in the 1890s when Britain pushed harder for unrestricted trade. The Oba at the time, Oba Ovenramwen Nogbisi, resisted. He controlled the flow of palm oil, ivory, and rubber, refusing to give the British the free hand they demanded. In January 1897, things came to a breaking point. A British diplomatic mission, led by James Phillips, set out for Benin City. Officially, they claimed it was just to discuss trade with the Oba. In reality, they had brought soldiers and weapons. The timing was disastrous. The Oba was in the middle of a sacred religious festival and had forbidden visitors. When the British force ignored the warnings and marched toward the city, Benin warriors ambushed them. Most of the expedition was wiped out. In London, this was called the Benin Massacre, but for the Edo people, it was self-defense. They had defended their palace and their king against what they saw as an armed invasion. The British response was swift and brutal. Just weeks later, they launched what they called the Punitive Expedition. Over 1,200 soldiers heavily armed with Maxim guns, the world's first true machine guns, marched on Benin City. What followed was one of the most devastating acts of destruction in African history. The British stormed the city, meeting fierce resistance from Edo warriors armed mostly with spears and a few rifles. Despite their courage, the defenders were no match for modern firepower. The British cut through the city, burning villages, killing civilians, and pushing straight toward the palace. When they reached the royal palace, the soldiers set it on fire. Halls that had stood for centuries, courtyards where rituals had been performed, shrines filled with sacred objects, all went up in flames. The Oba fled into hiding, while chiefs and palace officials were executed. The spiritual heart of Benin was deliberately destroyed. What couldn't be burned was looted. Soldiers carted away thousands of bronzes, ivories, masks, and other treasures. One British officer later admitted that the looting was wholesale and systematic. Every bronze plaque was stripped from the palace pillars. Sacred ivory tusks were pried from their altars. Masks, jewelry, and even everyday palace objects were carried off. The scale of the looting was staggering. Historians estimate that at least 3,000 to 5,000 artworks were stolen. They were shipped to London, where they were sold to cover the costs of the expedition. The bronzes ended up in the British Museum, the Berlin Ethnological Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and dozens of other institutions and private collections. To this day, many of the most famous pieces of Benin's art are outside Nigeria. For the Edo people, the loss was devastating. The palace wasn't just destroyed, their history was stolen. Every bronze plaque had told a story, every carving a piece of memory. With the palace gone and the treasures shipped away, a culture's record of itself was ripped apart. Eventually, Oba Ovenramwen was captured. He was paraded before the British, humiliated, and then exiled to Calabar, far from his people. He never returned to Benin City, dying in exile in 1914. The once mighty palace was reduced to ashes. The British built administrative buildings on its ruins. The spiritual, political, and cultural center of Benin was silenced. The destruction of Benin's palaces in 1897 wasn't just the fall of a kingdom. It was the deliberate erasure of an entire chapter of African history. The world remembers Versailles, the Forbidden City, and the pyramids, but the palaces of Benin were burned and looted into obscurity. And yet the story doesn't end there. Because even in exile, even in ruins, the memory of the palaces lived on. And today the fight to reclaim that memory is louder than ever. When the smoke cleared, Benin City lay in ruins. The palaces that had stood for centuries, homes of kings, symbols of divine power, living museums of art and history, were gone. What remained were charred walls, broken shrines, and the echo of drums that would never be heard again. The British carved up Benin's lands, folding them into their colonial territories. Chiefs who had once sworn loyalty to the Oba were now forced to answer to colonial officers. The rhythm of life in the palace, rituals, festivals, councils of war, and artistic creation, was silenced. For the Edo people, it was more than the loss of a building. It was the loss of identity, of continuity, of memory. But while the palaces had been destroyed, their spirit lived on in the art that had been looted. The bronzes and ivories that once lined palace walls began to appear in European galleries almost immediately. Auction houses in London sold them to collectors. The British Museum took hundreds. German museums acquired hundreds more. French, Dutch, and American institutions soon followed. To European audiences, the Benin bronzes were shocking. How could Africans, whom colonial propaganda painted as uncivilized, create such masterpieces? The bronzes shattered those stereotypes, but instead of crediting the Edo people, Europeans displayed them as trophies of conquest. By the early 20th century, the Benin bronzes had become famous worldwide. Yet in Benin itself, the palace walls were bare, the altars empty. The people who had created these works were left with only memory. For decades, Nigeria and the descendants of the Edo people have called for the return of the looted treasures. The argument is simple. These objects were not given, not traded. They were stolen in an act of war. They are the heart of Benin's history, and they belong in Benin City, not behind glass in London or Berlin. But European institutions resisted. The British Museum in particular has long claimed that the bronzes are world heritage and safer in London. For years, this refusal became a bitter symbol of colonial arrogance. Recently, though, the tide has begun to turn. In 2021, Germany announced it would return hundreds of Benin bronzes to Nigeria. Universities and smaller museums in the US and UK have begun repatriating their collections too. For the first time in over a century, some of the treasures are coming home. Back in Benin City, the story isn't over. The Oba's descendants still live there, carrying on the traditions of the royal court. The modern palace of the Oba of Benin may not look like the sprawling complex of the past, but it remains a symbol of Edo identity. There are also ambitious plans to rebuild. The Edo Museum of West African Art, MOWAA, is being developed in Benin City, designed by Ghanaian-British architect David Ajayi. The idea is not just to house returned bronzes, but to revive the memory of the palaces themselves, to show the world that Benin was, and still is, a center of creativity and culture. The story of Benin's hidden palaces isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It challenges the way history has been told, a history that often erased Africa's achievements. It shows how colonialism didn't just steal resources, but also culture and memory. And it reminds us that heritage isn't just something to admire in museums, it's something that belongs to the people who created it. When we talk about the palaces of Benin, we're not just talking about ruins. We're talking about the resilience of a people, the brilliance of their art, and the fight to restore what was taken. Imagine this. One of the stolen bronze plaques, after more than 120 years in a European museum, finally returned to Benin. The crowd gathers. Elders sing songs of remembrance. Children who have never seen their history outside a book now see it before them, shining in the sunlight. It's more than an artifact. It's a piece of memory coming home. That moment is the real climax of this story. The palaces may have been burned, but the spirit of Benin was never destroyed. The hidden palaces of Benin were once among the most dazzling in the world, centers of politics, spirituality, and art that stunned every visitor. They were destroyed in fire and looted into silence, but their memory endures. Today, the fight to reclaim them, through returning bronzes, rebuilding museums, and retelling history, is bringing that memory back to life. The world is finally starting to recognize what the Edo people always knew, that the palaces of Benin were not just African treasures, but human treasures. And in remembering them, we don't just uncover the past, we challenge the way we think about history itself. Subscribe for more untold stories history tried to erase.